Welcome back to Sophisticated Motherhood, where today we're going to be talking about the 10 things I wish I would have known before I started breastfeeding. This is my second journey around. The first time I learned a whole bunch. The second time I've learned even more, so I want to share some of those things with you. And the first that I definitely didn't account for was the physical, mental, and emotional toll that breastfeeding takes. I did not realize how much my emotions would be tied to breastfeeding. I was really fortunate that I didn't necessarily deal with postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety or any of those types of issues postpartum. I will say though, I dealt with a lot of emotions tied to breastfeeding very early on with my first, when I was worried that I wasn't producing breast milk early enough. We had to introduce some formula in the beginning, just when we were in the hospital. I felt like a failure. There was a lot of emotions tied to it when I was discussing it with my husband, and he would give suggestions, and I felt like they were personal attacks on me. Just because it is such an intimate experience, there's emotions there. Also, when it comes to weaning, there's a whole other wave of emotions there. But beyond the emotional part of it, that physical and mental toll that it takes on you as well. Of course, the mental is tied to the part that I was just talking about, the emotions, but you're constantly worried about things like your supply, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And just the logistics of it is very time consuming on your mental space. And then physically, it's very demanding on your body. It's very time consuming. And I knew those things going into it, but again, I don't think I really realized the amount of time that it takes to do additional things. Like if you are going to also be pumping, it's going to take time to wash the pump parts, get your pumps ready, to like measure milk, pour it in milk storage bags, do all of that work. But it's also going to be just time consuming feeding your baby. It takes a long time, and I didn't realize that you kind of start the timer of the hours or amount of time between feeds from the time you start breastfeeding until the next time you start breastfeeding. So let's say your baby's really slow and they're going to breastfeed for like 20 or 30 minutes or something. You might only have a couple of hours where you have a break from breastfeeding, or if you're pumping and you're pumping for 20 plus minutes, you really don't have that long in between those times. So it is extremely time consuming, and that's something I just didn't really think about. The next big category I wish I would have understood more is just education. And I want to expand on that a little bit and what I mean by education. I took breastfeeding classes, and I think I learned a lot going into it. I learned about different positions that you can breastfeed, about how long you can keep milk out, all of those like basic logistics. But there are a few things that I wasn't fully educated on. Things like how long it takes for your milk to actually come in. I knew that it could take a little while, but I didn't know exactly how long it would take. And it can take up to 5 days for your milk to actually fully come in. And I think the more education you have about these things, the more you're empowered to take control of your breastfeeding journey. I also didn't understand, talking about when your milk comes in, that if you start to supplement with formula because maybe you're fearful that your milk's not in yet, or somebody else is telling you that your milk's not in yet, so your baby needs to be fed, so you need to introduce formula, the more that you give them anything other than your breast, the more that it's going to impact your supply and reduce your supply. And especially in those early days, it's very, very critical to have your baby nursing all the time, cluster feeding, all of that type of stuff to help bring your milk in, and also to establish that milk supply and the milk supply that your baby actually needs. So those types of things, I didn't understand all of the nuances of it. And now at this point, maybe with my first journey and even with my second journey, I would have changed things if I had just a little bit more information. And building upon that, this is kind of contradictory of what I just said, but you can't account for everything. You can't research absolutely everything before you start breastfeeding. So while it's important to be as educated as you can, there are things that you may have never heard of, or you're probably not going to come across in your basic research of breastfeeding, or maybe they're not even going to ever apply to you. Let's say you're never going to have a clogged duct. I think it's important to be aware of clogged ducts and mastitis, and that can happen during your breastfeeding. But maybe fully researching all of the nuanced details of how to relieve a clogged duct or mastitis or whatever it might be could be a little bit of a wormhole that may potentially be a waste of your time if you never have to deal with that. For example, with my first, I dealt with what's called milk blebs. I had never heard of those before, and I had no idea what was going on. It was really painful. It's related to a clogged duct. I can go into detail another time if that's of interest, because I kind of learned what to do with them, but that was something I had never heard of before. Breastfeeding is also a very fine balance. There's lots of things that are extremely delicate when it comes to breastfeeding, and everyone has their own opinions on them, like if and when to introduce a pacifier, if and when to introduce a bottle, when to start pumping, all of that stuff. I hit certain parts correctly, I think, with my first, and then did it incorrectly with my second, and vice versa when it came to introducing all of those things, or different things when it came to my supply, increasing it and decreasing it. Things like exercise, some people say, can decrease your supply, or if you're trying to lose weight and reduce your calories, that can impact supply. Again, all of these fine balances, you have to kind of just roll with the punches a little bit. And again, do your research, because a lot of those things are very important. You know, if you introduce a bottle too early, then your baby may have a preference for the bottle and refuse breastfeeding. Or what's happened with my second is we probably introduced the bottle a little bit too late, and he had no interest in taking a bottle, and I think we missed a little bit of that window, so taking a bottle is much more of a struggle for him. Same with pumping too early, or even using milk catchers and collectors that have some suction to them. That can impact your supply and lead to an oversupply if you do those things too early in the process. So again, this ties back to education. And my next thing I wish I would have known is there are so many resources out there, and there are so many places that you can find help and assistance. This time around, I worked with my insurance company. They actually reached out to me proactively because they knew I was pregnant. They assigned like a nurse to work with me, and she helped me understand a lot of the resources that my insurance company had. Not only basics like ordering a breast pump, but also they have their own system of lactation consultants, and under my insurance, I was actually able to go use their lactation program for free. My hospital also had a lactation program where moms would meet up once a week, and I could use that. It was completely free. We also here in Omaha, Nebraska, as well as Lincoln, Nebraska, have actually several different lactation places that you can go to. There's one that I use that has a couple of locations, and you do have to pay to go there to have a one-on-one visit with a lactation consultant. My insurance does cover a few of those sessions as well, but they also do have a mom's group there that is free. It's also on Zoom, so I can join that if I ever want to like chat with other moms, and in a group setting, talk to a lactation consultant. Also, when you're in the hospital and you give birth, you can request, depending on your hospital, to speak to a lactation consultant once, twice, multiple times, have them look at you while you breastfeed, give you advice there. You can even bring your pump to the hospital and have them check to make sure the flanges fit you properly, and maybe give you some advice on using your pump if you're a first-time mom and have never used a breast pump before, because that can be overwhelming. But again, the whole point is there are so many different resources out there, whether they're community-based, online resources, or resources through your insurance company. Okay, let's talk about pain. I don't know what I thought about breastfeeding and how it would feel pain-wise versus not having any pain. Of course, the typical breastfeeding and the typical pumping, you should not be experiencing pain in general. If you're experiencing pain with just like your daily pumping, your daily breastfeeding, something is probably off, whether it's the latch of your baby or the way that your flanges and your breast pump fits your actual breast. You need to address that. You should not be in pain on a daily basis. But it's sometimes unavoidable that there's going to be some pain along your journey, whether it is something like a clogged duct that becomes mastitis, or those milk blebs that I talked about, which were so painful, or like I was just talking about, just a really shallow latch or a poor latch can lead to dry and cracked nipples, which really hurt, or even basic things just like breast engorgement can be really uncomfortable if you haven't relieved through either breastfeeding or pumping in a while. It can be kind of painful, and I didn't realize that there would be pain like that can happen so often during the journey, but I don't want to scare you if you are new to breastfeeding. Again, in general, there should not be pain that you're feeling. This one is for second, third, fourth time moms, whatever you might be, but every single baby is different and they're very different in the way that they breastfeed. I think I thought about the fact that with our second, he could maybe have like a lip tie or a tongue tie or something like that that maybe needed to be released that my first one didn't have. But I didn't think about like the instinctual ability to latch or maybe their comfort in different nursing positions. I used one position with my first, and with my second, he kind of like prefers something a little bit different. And I was so used to breastfeeding one way that I ended up with a lot of problems and pain when I first started breastfeeding my second because I wasn't taking the time to really understand how my second baby preferred to breastfeed, what was working for him, what wasn't working for him, and really addressing his latch and all of that. So paying attention to your individual baby's needs and making sure that they are breastfeeding properly is extremely important. And just because your breastfeeding journey goes one way with one child doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go the exact same way with a second, third, fourth, or whatever. Let's talk about supply. I didn't know what a big thing milk supply would be. Of course, I understood the concept that breast milk is liquid gold, but as somebody who was not an oversupplier or like an underproducer, I pretty much produced as much as my baby needed for the first year of life. We stopped breastfeeding after I hit a year, and he drank all of the milk that I produced. I think I had like one bag that I kept in the freezer for a while, just more so sentimental purposes, but it just kind of sat there. But again, he drank everything that I had. So a lot of times as we had a nanny in the house and she was giving him bottles, I was like pumping because we were running out of milk, and I would hand her milk that I directly pumped and pour it straight into a bottle to give to him because I didn't have a lot of backstock, and the stress that can go along with that. Everything that I've mentioned previously, you know, the mental, physical, emotional, how time consuming it is, education, the fine balance of when to introduce pumps, how often, all of that stuff is tied to supply. I felt like it was my responsibility to keep my baby fed, and that's a lot of weight on your shoulders, right? And trying to keep that supply up and keep yourself healthy is a lot to deal with, which leads to the next thing is that breastfeeding can be really discouraging at many, many points. I've been talking a little bit about those bumps along the way, but oftentimes you might feel like you just want to give up or be done with it, which if you have reached that point and you've kind of used all of your resources and you've actually come to that decision, then that is the right decision for you. Of course, making sure your baby is fed is the most important thing, as well as your mental health, your physical health, all of that stuff. So if the breastfeeding journey turns out to not be for you, I completely get it because of how discouraging it can be. And it can be discouraging because it's difficult logistically maybe to pump out and about and on the go. I actually have a whole video that I filmed on tips on pumping on the go if that's something that you are interested in. I will link that video so you can check that out. But another thing that can really help if you are going through those periods of feeling a little bit discouraged is making sure you have a support system, whether it's a friend that's currently breastfeeding or has previously breastfed. Maybe you have a partner that's really understanding of what you're going through and you can talk to them about it. I personally found it was helpful to have somebody that had breastfed before because they really understood what I was going through. And I was talking about, okay, my baby's taking in this many ounces when they're at daycare and it's really stressful for me, which this is a current situation right now as my second has transitioned to daycare and is guzzling milk. I'm stressed over the supply and how much I'm producing versus how much he's taking in. It was helpful to be able to talk to a friend about that. I also called my pediatrician as a resource and as a source of encouragement. So know that there might be some points that you get discouraged along the way, but have a plan in place of how you are going to keep that encouragement up and the positive attitude, because it takes a lot to get to that 1 year mark or whatever your breastfeeding goal might be. The last thing is that there's a love-hate relationship with breastfeeding. I think I expected it to just be a love relationship and have this beautiful bonding experience with my baby, which I 100% feel like breastfeeding is a beautiful bonding experience. not all women feel like that in general. In general, some women just don't enjoy it. There's a feeling associated with it, or it's just a struggle that ends up not working out for them, and they never experience that love part at all. So for some people, there is no love part of it, but for me, it is a loving experience to bond with my baby, and I really, really enjoy that. And I think that's what fuels me and keeps me going through the breastfeeding journey. But there are so many downsides to breastfeeding. Again, there are so many positives, like it's free to breastfeed, it is convenient in a lot of senses, but there's also certain times where it's very inconvenient. There's positives and negatives, but knowing that there can be this kind of love-hate dynamic with breastfeeding can help you focus on what the positives are to help get you through it. And trust me, I'm still in the thick of it with baby number 2. He is just a few months old at this point, so we have quite a bit to go, lots more bumps along the way, as I mentioned. I have another video that I would love to share on breastfeeding hacks if that's something that's interesting to you. I have a few little tips and tricks that I have learned that I think might help a little bit if you are a first or even if you're a second or third time mom. That might be interesting, so let me know if that's something you want to see later. I would love if you subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. But again, as always, I want to thank you for joining me in this motherhood journey as together we make it sophisticated.